going to start off with doing a little bit of Q&A. Then we'll go through a handful of personal statements, and then we'll take it from there. Who has a question that brought them here tonight regarding personal statements? Just raise your hand, and I'm happy to take care of it.
Thanks so much. Okay, Steve, really quick question. I know that the personal statement needs to maybe cover like an obstacle that you've overcome, and also maybe answer the question of why law, like why a transition, especially if I'm moving from one career and I'm making a total switch. So my question is, is it important that the personal statement equally balances both of those topics, or just be maybe like really cover one of those really well? Like I heard an example of somebody wrote a personal statement of learning how to ride a bike to become a better team player. And I guess I'm curious, is like, does it have to like answer all of the questions for a personal statement, or be really good at one of those?
I would focus on doing one thing and doing one thing well. I'll actually give some examples in a little bit about how you could address various topics in different statements, but you don't want to limit it to one statement, and you don't want to limit it to one, you don't want to try and cram it all into one statement. It's too much. It's too much. So pick one thing, focus on it, go really deep on it. Other topics could be for separate personal statements or separate like diversity statement, character and fitness, optional essay or addenda of some kind, but I wouldn't try to do it all in one place. Thank you for that. Great question. Rianka?
So kind of like Alyssa's question, when you do have several things that you want to say that aren't necessarily reflected in your resume or any of the other things, kind of where's the playing field for how much you should say about all those different things? So let's say you can't talk about 7 things individually in there, but let's say you do want to do 2 or 3 things. Kind of how do you balance that out?
It's tough choices, but some things will be better for a personal statement. Some things will be better for a diversity statement. Other things, there might just not be room for it, period. And unfortunately, not every story can get told. If you've got 7 different things, there's not 7 different essays. So some things might be covered on a more surface level in the resume, but other things you might choose to go deeper on.
So is it kind of the equivalent of like a cover letter to a resume?
Not exactly.
Some of those things?
Not exactly. A cover letter is a cover letter. And in a way, a cover letter is simply highlighting a couple of key things from your resume in sentence form, but you're still not going deep on them. And it's also a completely different purpose. A cover letter is typically to get a job, right? It's expressing your interest in the job and calling out certain things about why your resume makes you a good fit for that job. Personal statement is totally different. The role there is to show a completely different side of yourself and help them get to know you better, and also to get them to like you.
Okay, that's fair. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. And we can talk about specific examples if you'd like. Are there certain things that you're considering as for being for one statement or another?
Yeah, so like for me, I'm coming from a completely different career, going into law. So I'm from the natural sciences. So like my resume and stuff would show those things, but not necessarily specific to like a job or something like that, just kind of generally speaking, which is why I kind of said the cover letter, where you like kind of bring in just a few of those elements that are kind of tied to the resume and they just expand on them a little bit. So that's more or less why I was asking that.
Yeah, I'd be coming at it from a different angle. I'd be thinking about what are some personal stories you want to share. Don't think about this in the job context. Think about this in a personal context, more like the things you might talk about in therapy, things you might talk about when you're doing deep work, journaling, diaries, things of that nature. And I know it's funny, but it should make you a little bit uncomfortable because you want it to be emotionally compelling. And a cover letter for a job, it's not emotional. It's not going to make you cry. But I've read personal statements that got me choked up. And that's really, I think you want to get that powerful with it. And it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to make you a little bit uneasy. But I think those are the best statements.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah, of course.
Hi, my name's Sunny. I just have a quick question about the weight on the personal statements. So from my understanding, there is GPA, then the LSAT score, and then the personal statement. So is it split evenly, 33% for each section?
Not at all. Not at all. I would say it's probably something like 35 LSAT, 35 GPA, and then 30 everything else put together. That's a rough ballpark. I'm sure I've given different rough estimates in the past, but it's along those lines. It could be 40 LSAT, 30 GPA, then again, 30 everything else. So the personal statement, the resume, the rec letters, all put together are maybe a third, maybe even less than that. That being said, though, you still want to give every part of the application your all.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I have a question, Steve. Oh,
Go ahead.
thanks, Jasmine. I'm 38 years old, and so I suspect my undergrad GPA is going to be less of a the personal statement, I'm guessing in my circumstance, is going to be a little more important. I wanted to ask about the suitability of a topic. I have been volunteering in the area supporting women in college coaching, and gender equity in sports is my passion, and that's what's driving me to want to go to law school. And so I'm thinking that'll give me the opportunity to include some personal stories and whatnot, and wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, sure. So what are the stories?
I helped my friend. My friend got basically forced out of her job illegally when she became a mom. She was a woman coaching, and she got forced out. Helped her file her EEOC complaint, which her lawyer ended up using to help her get a settlement. And I can't really talk about. I can't really reveal too much data, but me helping her advocate for herself, which she's told me she wouldn't have done otherwise, started me down the path of research, going into research, and triggered all this stuff. So. Yeah.
That sounds cool. That sounds like great work. I would just make sure it's focused on you more than her story. So your journey as an advocate, navigating bureaucracies, navigating rules, researching, looking things up, figuring it out, and then how you changed as a person through your advocacy work. Don't make it all about her story.
Yeah, more of that being the catalyst and then what that did for me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I also
Jasmine?
have a question.
Shoot.
Related to how personal you should get with each law school. For example, if a law school is specialized in like medical law and that kind of practice, like would I want to gear my personal statement to kind of looking like that if I have that kind of background?
Yeah, you could bring that in. Yeah, I don't think you need to personalize different statements for every single school. They're not that concerned generally about which particular area of law you'll practice because they know it can change over time.
Yeah, okay, because I wasn't sure, because I had mentioned in my personal statement, like certain courses that I wanted to do in mediation, because I thought that that's something that, I really liked, that I thought was really needed, and I wasn't sure how much I could bring into my application.
Yeah, you can. You can bring that up as a closing in your main personal statement, or there may be room to talk about why this particular law school, and then list those particular courses there. Some schools have room for that, some don't. Some like to have it. Yale, of course, Emily, I know you're listening, doesn't like to have that. So that's one thing to be aware of.
Yeah, there's also just a follow-up question to that too. I had an editor look at my personal statement, and she does just, applications to grad schools just in general. And so she had told me as reference that, I should be adding what I could contribute to their school. So not just the narrative. And I was a little bit confused because I just thought, isn't this supposed to be something where I open up? So should it, and is it worth, I guess, kind of saying how I can contribute to their school as a student if I were to be a JD candidate there?
Your whole application talks about how you can contribute
Hello?
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah. So your
Sorry.
whole application,
My internet's bad.
connection. Yeah. You're really looking to, throughout your entire application, all parts of it are showing how you can contribute in one way or another. And so I think it's really not about like making the argument directly, again, showing, not telling. You're showing it through your various experiences, what's on your resume, what's in your personal statement, what's in any of your other essays. All of that is put together a very compelling package. So it'll come across, but you don't need to say, I'm going to be involved in this activity or that other activity. It's nice to mention to show you've done the research, but I wouldn't go about it so overtly.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for hosting this. And I just wanted to quickly follow up on Jasmine's question, which is similar to what I was thinking about. So I know that the majority of the statement should be focusing on telling a story. I was just wondering, is it worthwhile to kind of maybe in the last paragraph or so explicitly state how this ties to wanting to go to law school? Or should this all be kind of shown throughout the story that you're trying to tell?
I think it's typically better if it's a little bit more subtle, but if you want to tie it back together more directly in the conclusion of the essay, you can certainly do that. But it should be apparent that law school is a good idea for you at this moment in time, that it's the next natural step in helping you achieve your career goals. So we'll see some drafts. I'm sure, I know a lot of the drafts that I come across tend to do that. And if it's more organic and it flows naturally, that's great, but don't feel the obligation to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I have another question,
Sure.
which is something I think about all the time. So I honestly sometimes don't know why I want to go to law school. If law school is the best thing for me, all that sort of thing. Is that something that's okay to say in there? Just be, I mean, because part of it's like figuring out what I want to do once I get there, having a general idea, but I don't really have any specifics about that. So at what point do you open up about that sort of vulnerability in a personal statement, or do you just completely avoid it?
I wouldn't consider that a vulnerability. I would consider that something you got to figure out now. So that's to me, that's more than a vulnerability. That's you making a 3-year commitment and a gamble of over $100,000 that you're not really sure about. And I know that there are a lot of people who are in this position. So this isn't particular to you. Certainly a lot of folks are in that situation where they're not really sure what to do with their careers. They majored in the humanities. So they're not going to go in a variety of other paths, but law school seems like a natural step when you're not sure what else to do, buys you some more time for 3 years, but it's an enormous investment of time and energy and dedication. And once you finish, that's your path. If you've got a JD, you're going to want to do something in that area. And a lot of other things are actually no longer suitable options for you because they'll see that JD and they'll be like, well, why aren't you doing the law? So it's important that at this very moment in time, you take some time, set it aside, and really think long and hard about why you want to go to law school. Take that time, think long and hard why you want to go to law school, why that is the best option for you right now, and do the research about law schools and what programs they offer and what sorts of jobs that naturally prepares you for. But given all the investment that you're going to make in that path, you've got to take the time to think about that.
So something that I need to do in my personal time. So is there any sort of that, let's just say I know I want to go to a general field. Do I just talk about that field in some sort of way and not just be like, I don't know if I want to be a blah, blah, blah lawyer or this or that, and just completely like sidestep that?
I would circle back first to just actually personal statement and application aside, really take some time to think about, one, why does law school appeal to you? Why does the practice of law appeal to you? And then secondly, look at your experiences up to this point, what you did in college. If you have work experience, what your work experience is like and how those sorts of skills tie into the kinds of skills that a lawyer uses. And then some potential paths you might want to take. And then after you've done that, then think about, okay, what are some compelling stories that would be good fits for personal statements? But I see these as two separate processes. The first step is if you decide whether law school is right for you at this moment in time, just because you're making a massive investment in your future and there's no backseas on this. You know, if you invest a semester's worth of tuition in law school or a year's worth of tuition, both in the money and in the time, if you exit after that point, it's all thrown away. And maybe you had fun and it was a good time, but is that worth $25,000, $50,000 plus opportunity costs just for that experience, for it to be a good time? Not really. And law school really isn't a good time in a lot of ways. It's a lot of work. So take the time to think about whether you actually even want to really do this, or are there any one number of other things you could be doing instead? And then only if you decide that law school is right for you, then actually start thinking about, okay, I'm going to put together my application. But I think you're not even at the point yet where personal statement is the right thing for you to be thinking about yet.
That's fair. That's fair.
As a side note, I wrote a personal statement and it ended up being all about why I didn't want to go to law school. So I didn't apply. It was like 90% why I didn't have a lot of faith in international institutions like the United Nations after having done a lot of advocacy work there in the nonprofit sector. And I was kind of jaded and cynical about all of that. And then I was like, I don't like doing any of that stuff anymore. Guess I'll do something else with my legal career. And it's like, my brother's like, you don't really want to go to law school, do you? I'm like, I guess not. So that's what I figured out through that process. But I wasn't taking time to really think about why law school was good for me or why law was right for me. I just had a lot of experiences that were kind of sour on my view. So through that process, I actually discovered something about myself, and free writing can do that. So I would take some time to think about that.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Emily writes, we all need a Steve's brother asking the tough questions. And yeah, that's exactly right. And that's part of why having outside voices, outside feedback can really help, because it can be hard to see things for yourself sometimes. Other questions, Claudine?
Hi, yes. Thank you for doing this, by the way. So I am 41 years old, and I am going to law school. I'm applying, obviously, and I went to law school when I was 23. I did the whole thing. I got in, and I did my first year, and I failed out. And I've lived, like a whole long life in between then and now. And now I'm going to do it. I know what I want to do with it. I have all of that stuff. But how on earth am I going to convince these schools to take me back? Like, that's in my mind. Like, oh, she failed out. She wasn't able to do it. Like, why would they take me back? Even with all my passion and all that. Like, I don't know. I get stuck when I get to that part.
Well, I guess I would ask what's changed for you. And it's been a very long time. It's like that's nearly half a lifetime, right? So a lot's happened, a lot of experiences, you've learned and grown. So the question is, what's different now than back then? What's changed in your personal life? How have you grown? How have you matured?
Well, I guess like specifically like with the law, I got divorced. I had babies. I got them taken away. I got them back. My dad passed away, and I had a huge trust inheritance battle. So like those three things right there, I mean, I was, hit in the face with courtrooms and going to court and filing stuff and doing all these things that, when I went to law school the first time around, I remember being in Tor's class and I was like, oh, this is just very snobby kind of like immature attitude, where I didn't really understand what all this was for, but now I've lived it. And so if I can help, hold on one second. Can you guys sit out of the room, please? Out. Sorry, my kids. Now that I've lived it, I have that passion to be able to help. Whereas before, I didn't know what I wanted to do with it. I just went to law school just because. But I went and I didn't do well. So like, why am I going to do well this time?
That's up to you to figure out. That's up to you to tell them what's different specifically. And so having had kids, having been through various legal battles, what's changed for you? What's your understanding of the law, and what is your ability to commit to this process this time? I mean, it's not for me to tell you what's going to be different. I think that you've got to think about what's going to be different. As Janine's saying in the chat, you just said why. And so, I mean, we're recording this. It's going to be on YouTube. You can go back and watch this video and you'll see exactly what you just said. Write that down and have that be a starting point for you to jump off and start going into more depth. But you've got to know the answer to that, because if you don't know, how are they going to know? You've got to be convinced that it's the right decision for you to go down this path once again, having been through a lot in the interim, to have a different experience.
Okay, thank you.
Of course, but I wouldn't be too concerned about, given how much time has passed, they will be able to understand that you're a different person now than you were back then. So don't assume that, like, it's not like it's been 6 months or a year later. Jasmine says you've got this, which I agree. And Emily says, after 5 years, your grades are expired. Don't you have that long to complete a degree? Well, I mean, LSAT scores are expired, but they still go off your undergrad GPA. The undergrad GPA is still there.
They still ask for your transcripts too.
Correct. Yes, so their GPA is still there. The undergrad transcript is still there. But having been a long time since then, they'll weigh that a little bit less heavily. They'll weigh the LSAT a little bit more, and they'll weigh the application and the soft factors a little bit more as well.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
We've got a question from Jenny here. How personal is too personal? Jenny, you want to share more on that?
I want to know, like, how personal is too personal. Like, say if you want to, like, you want to write about your story about how you want to get into law school and your personal life. Like, but I understand that, like, there should be a line between what's personal and what's not. Like, how do you go by, like, not feeling petty or feeling like needy when writing your personal statement?
It's a good question. I think it's all about tone and perspective. I think you want to share enough that you feel a little bit uncomfortable doing it, because if you're not feeling uncomfortable, you're probably not going far enough. But at the same time, you don't want to go to the point of TMI, making them recoil. And you also don't want to be too emo about it. Like, you don't want this to be a pity party. You don't want this to just be complaining or making excuses. You can explain things, but you want to show another side of yourself. That's really what it's about. And Jasmine's pointing out resiliency. And I think that's exactly correct. I've talked about the idea of post-traumatic growth, the idea that you may have gone through something difficult, but how have you grown from the experience? What have you learned from it? As Jasmine says here, you can have a challenging situation, but show how powerful and strong it's made you. We've got a question from Mariam about differentiating between topics for personal statements and diversity. A lot of times there is overlap. One could be the other. Depends where you want to focus. And if you want to write both statements, personal statement is by default, everyone's going to write that. Diversity statement is optional. You can choose to write one or not. So if you have two topics, but one of them suitable for diversity statement, go with that. Take it in that direction. Do you want to share more, Mariam?
Hi, by the way.
Hi.
I'm kind of debating between what topics I want to write for each one, because for personal statement, I want to kind of focus on my immigration journey and like the legal battles between that. And then for diversity, I kind of want to talk about immigration as well as like first generation and where I come from and stuff like that. So I kind of felt like it was going to overlap. And I didn't know if it was okay or not.
Yeah, it's okay. They can overlap. Sometimes it's natural that they overlap, but you go much deeper in on one topic, and the other one, it's simply referenced in passing. And that's fine. I mean, they're going to read both of them. Typically,
Okay.
a lot of times by default, people assume diversity statements will be about race and ethnicity, and that is pretty common. It doesn't have to be limited to that only. But if you have a topic related to race or ethnicity, that's a good natural place to put as a diversity statement. And then something else could be for the main personal statement.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I have two questions.
Sure.
Can you hear me? Okay. So the first one is, I've heard before, like, as an advice that if you can fill everything up, like do a diversity statement, do a personal statement, because the more stuff you put, you're giving like a more holistic view of yourself or a little more of yourself. And I wanted to see what your thoughts were about that. And then my second question is, who would be good candidates to have them read your personal statements and give you that feedback? In the past, I've used professors, but I don't know if that specifically. I've also heard some people say maybe people who know you. So those were my two questions, just in general.
Yeah, sure. So I do tend to agree that you should take opportunities to tell them more about yourself when you can. So if you've got something good to share, then do it. If you, with a little bit of creativity and brainstorming, I think most people can have reason to write something compelling in a personal statement and a diversity statement and an optional essay and a character and fitness only when the situation warrants it, obviously. But I wouldn't, for example, I wouldn't take, let's say you've been arrested for something that you did. I wouldn't make that the personal statement and then not write a character and fitness. I would put that in the character and fitness and find something else to talk about for the personal statement. So automatically, you've been arrested, you did something, or maybe you didn't do something, but you got to disclose it. I wouldn't only make that the personal statement and leave it there. Or if you are not to represent a minority, I wouldn't only make that a personal statement. I would probably use the opportunity to make that a diversity statement and talk about that there, and then talk about something else in the personal statement. Or as the previous person said, Mariam was talking about being immigrating to the US, and that as a personal statement, and then talking about something else in the diversity statement. I think most people have the chance to write at least two, and probably three. You could, you could write an addendum for a low GPA or a low LSAT score, potentially, depending on the details. But if you got a low GPA because things were going on while you were in college, I wouldn't make it the focus of the personal statement and then not say anything else about yourself. So I do like the idea of taking more opportunities to talk about different topics in more areas. That being said, I wouldn't just aim to fill it up for the sake of filling it up. Don't waste their time with it. But again, with some brainstorming, with some creativity, if you just sit down for an hour and think about the 7 biggest events in your life, you just write down 7 big events that shaped you from the time that you were 2 years old until the present. Most people have 7 major turning points, major life events where things could have gone one way or another way, and everything shifted as a result of that. So if you take some time to think about that, you'll find there's probably 3 good topics right there. So which could be personal statement, diversity statement, then some optional essay or a character and fitness or both. Then the other question regarding who should read your essays. it's all based on the relationships with people you have. So if you've got a good relationship with a professor, then that's a good person to ask. I wouldn't ask them if they don't know you very well, because they're probably not going to put that much effort into it, and they don't know you well enough to really say, does this show who you are? Does this speak to you? At the same time, though, I mean, asking family members or your best friend can be tough because they're not going to want to be critical. So you want people who have a little bit of distance, who aren't going to worry too much about hurting your feelings, and they're going to recognize that it's actually doing you a disservice to just say, oh, it looks great. When in reality, any first draft of writing probably has some major things that could be improved upon significantly with somebody who has a little bit of distance from you giving that feedback.
And then I guess I have one more question. Do you have any experience as far as having like a criminal record and how that affects? Because I know I'm formerly incarcerated, and I know that there's people who applied for law school who are formerly incarcerated and feel that they were kind of pushed aside because they're formerly incarcerated. And so I don't know if you have any experience as far as I think it was viewed a little more negatively towards them. So I never used it in a personal statement before. I didn't use it in undergrad, and so I'm just a little worried about that. But obviously, I'm going to talk about it, but I'm just, if you have any experience as far as that goes.
Yeah, sure. And being incarcerated doesn't automatically mean that you're going to be disqualified from law school. You can still go to law school. If you just Google, you'll see there are people who've been convicted of murder who've gone to law school and become practicing attorneys.
I have friends like that. So I am aware of that, but I just don't know as far as, I don't know. From what I've heard, they've said that a little bit of like, you kind of have to show that you're rehabilitated or something like that. And I just don't know if you have any experience or thoughts on that.
You want to show that you've grown and changed from the experience. And so you could reflect on if you were convicted of something, what you were convicted of. You could talk about what you learned from the experience of being incarcerated or going through the criminal justice system, and lessons learned, showing how you've matured and changed from the person you were back then compared to now. So just showing that growth, being personal. Obviously this could, you have reason to write a character and fitness disclosure. You could also maybe talk about it from a different perspective in the personal statement as well, or you could talk about something else too, depending on what you feel is right. But I would definitely not aim to sugarcoat it. I wouldn't aim to make excuses. I would just aim to explain, this is who I was, this is where I was at the time, this is what led to this circumstance, and this is what I've learned from the experience. This is where I'm at now.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Got a question in the chat regarding gap years. How do you incorporate your personal when you've taken 1 year off and then you come back, take another year off? I mean, gap years are normal, especially during COVID. A lot of people have gaps in their resumes due to job opportunities or internships falling through, or graduating from college, having a gap. It's fine. I mean, if you have a major gap, that could be a reason to write an addendum, but just be matter of fact about it. I don't see it as being a major problem.
Hi, I have a question. So my question is basically, if you feel like, I know that for your personal statement, you're supposed to write about sort of like why you want to pursue a career in law. But I'm sort of concerned that my why is sort of boring. So would it be bad for me to go off on a tangent to something that's more distantly related to my why?
What's your why, and why is it boring?
I mean, I basically interned for a summer as a constituent services advisor. And while there were like some cases that I had to, navigate the bureaucracy and research for that were like more heartfelt, I don't feel like I could write 2 pages on how they like inspired me. But more of the work I did was more so like little things like HOA disputes, helping the elderly.
I wouldn't automatically dismiss that as being boring. I would take some time to think about the real experiences you have with real people. I mean, constituent services, you're really interacting with members of the public, and you're helping them navigate bureaucracies. And it might seem boring to you because you're doing 1,000 of the same kind of case a lot of times. I've worked as a constituent services intern for a member of Congress, so I have a sense of what it's like. It's like immigration follow-ups and veterans affairs follow-ups and things of that nature, at least in my case. And it can seem routine to you, but it really does have an impact on people's lives. And so if you can think about some of the more emotionally compelling cases that you worked on and people that you helped, and maybe you follow up on their cases for months and months, and eventually you reach a resolution, hopefully a happy one in many cases. You could focus on one or two of those and just talk more about the details of the things that you did.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Just get concrete with it. Get concrete, get specific. It's not, the number, when you're looking at hundreds or thousands of them, it gets boring. But when you talk about one or two, it really becomes more real.
I guess talking about the diversity statement, I really had written off that a diversity statement would apply to me because I'm a white cisgender female, but I guess I'm realizing more and more of the aspects as I look into it might apply to me. So do you have any advice about maybe picking, one that's compelling, or if they're a couple to incorporate it, or, limiting that maybe, I guess?
Yeah, sure. It doesn't have to be related to race or ethnicity or your orientation in any way. It could be a totally different angle altogether. And those are going to be different for every single person. I just mentioned one that came to mind for me. I could talk about being Jewish. I probably wouldn't, because Jews are overrepresented. So that's not really going to get me a lot of points in various areas. I probably wouldn't go that angle. I'd find something else in my case. But I would think about what's something unique that you bring to the table that may not be represented fully.
I'm also struggling kind of writing the diversity statement, because I feel as though that, although I want to share some of the unique things that I would bring to the table, I kind of feel like it's turning out to be a sob story, and I don't want to do that. So I'm wondering, do you have any advice on how I would address some really, I guess, difficult or edgier topics, but do it in a way that's, incorporating the resiliency, but doing it so that it's related to law and bringing it back to what I'm actually trying to do?
Yeah, sure. Well, first off, I wouldn't say a diversity statement has to bring it back to law at all. So I would put that idea aside. I would think more specifically about what's a unique perspective that you bring. And you could talk about, if you faced hardships, you could talk about those. But I would think more about how it's giving you a unique perspective, and how maybe through some anecdotes, you can show that you look at things a little bit of a different way. Yeah.
By anecdotes, though, when you're trying to write something like that, it shouldn't be punchliney. It shouldn't be something like a metaphor that could, I guess you could do a metaphor, but I'm just afraid that if I go too, abstract, that people aren't going to get it, and that the applications people may look at me like, what is this girl talking about? Is she okay? So how much is too much?
It's all based on the examples. I'd have to look at specifics with you. And since you're in the course, we could do that another time. But the idea is that you talk about your things you've experienced, given your unique background, given your unique perspective, and how you would bring something unique to any room you walk into based upon that.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like this is also just to open up to the people here too, because I'm sure a lot of people feel this way with diversity statements, that not only is it kind of like that imposter syndrome when you're writing this, but there's kind of that, I guess, feeling of just being, maybe it's not adequate enough, or not, whatever, but kind of dismissing those feelings of, this was a hardship, or this was something that I could bring to the table, but then feeling like, no, there's so many people that I know that's so resilient, and they've struggled and really overcome it. So who am I? What really do I bring, So how do you guys overcome that?
I think something that really stood out to me, that even Steve mentioned earlier on this call, is anything that has to do with real people and real experiences. And when I really put in the time and thinking about it, I get more detailed, I realize that I have a full, obligation to show up as powerfully as I can. My experiences completely matter. I have full agency here on the earth. And the more detail I get with myself, I guess the real thing is, the more honest I am with myself, the easier it gets to feel confident about it, because it's real.
I would add too, also research. You mentioned earlier, when you go to an institution because you're spending your money, you want to see what kind of faculty and staff you have. As a graduate student, what I found, even when I had to conduct my grad research, even though I used everyone within my graduate program, there were several of my classmates who had to write their thesis with outside professors within the university. So, that's something you want to think about. If I'm going to go to this school, if they have a study abroad program, how do you fit within that? Every one of us has a skill set. We are going to add values to wherever we go. And keep in mind too, if you want to, conduct environmental justice, you might want to go to Vermont, right? Law school. Or if you want to deal with entertainment law. Maybe you want to go to UCLA. So you know where you want to go. Focus on that because it's so crucial and so important for you. You are valuable. So when you utilize your personal statements and your personal story, tie that in. Like, I remember writing about Rima Gobi, which is this, I'm an African-American woman, never been to Africa before. But when I saw her on PBS and I was like, they're like elderly, but they're older women protesting and they're wearing all white. And, it really inspired me, and I was really passionate about that. But when I wrote that in my personal statement, they didn't, I didn't include whether or not I went to Africa. It was just like this TV segment that inspired me to want to fight for, women's rights, human security, things like that. So I hope that helps. And, personal statements are important, but definitely tie that into a professor who's already doing research, maybe, sometimes reach out to those professors ahead of time. Hey, I'm thinking about going to the school. I know when I wanted to do research in Mozambique, I reached out to a professor across the country and, she was doing research, and so things like that, if you have time, that's my advice, because when they're reading your admissions letter, they want to know, like, you're serious about these things. And don't be afraid to call them too ahead of time. Sometimes you're a little bit shy about calling people. I know the GRE has it. I'm not sure about the LSAT, but it's like the GRE had a character strength type of survey. And so that's what I use to get in my graduate program. So I basically had people anonymously, or people I knew, they just talked about my character. I didn't get to see it, but the school saw it. So that's my advice. I hope it helps.
Thank you so much, Mariah. And thank you, Alyssa. For me as a Canadian, I think we only have the LSAT here. I don't know about the GRE, but that is something to take into account. So thank you for those notes.
Hey, thanks, Mariah. And Alyssa, Rianka, did you have something to share as well?
I was just going to say really quickly about the imposter syndrome. Just remember that you have a specific point of view that even though a lot of people may or may not have gone through that same sort of thing, you're the one that's trying to pursue it in law. Like, for me, I'm coming from an animal background. Like, I was a zookeeper. And there's a lot of people that are in the zookeeping industry that are super angry about how animals are treated, not necessarily just in the United States, but worldwide. But it doesn't mean that those people are the ones that are trying to do something about it in the legal setting. So you have to remember that even though they may or may not hold that same perspective or have gone through similar things, that you're saying that I not only represent myself, but I represent a lot of other people too. And I'm going to be the one that's going to take the steps into getting some of that change to happen. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
That's great. And back to the imposter syndrome itself. I mean, that alone could be a great topic for a diversity statement or a personal statement, talking about walking into the room and feeling like you don't deserve to be there. And how you feel there's that perception that everyone else does. And because of XYZ reasons, you might not feel that you're worthy to be there. When in reality, if you look more objectively, of course, your accomplishments dictate that you do deserve to be there. Even just that alone, you could do something with that.
I had one more quick question that kind of is tying along with some of the stuff that was talked about in the chat. So should we be referencing in our personal statement anything that occurred in very recent months, so in the past 3 to 6 months? Is this something that should be discussed at all in the personal statement? And if so, I would assume it should not be a central part of our personal statement, but rather something that's brought up closer to the end.
That's a good question. Yeah, I think that if it's fairly recent, that doesn't necessarily disqualify it. But I would tie it back to something a little bit older, just so that doesn't feel like law school is a sudden half-baked idea. I think that's a risk that you run. And then on the flip side, as was said in the chat, you don't want to go back to high school or earlier. You want to keep it fairly recent enough that it reflects who you are as an adult, not necessarily going back to childhood events and only focusing on childhood. So I would avoid those extremes too much, but it's okay to talk about recent events, certainly.
Okay, thank you. And just a really quick follow-up to that, is it also, like, would it be viewed negatively if we decide not to bring up these things if they don't directly relate to the story that we want to talk about in the personal statement?
You're asking if it's okay to not bring up these things?
Yeah, like, do they have to be directly referenced in essence? I think I'm having a hard time balancing whether it's something that should be, like, whether recent events should be referenced or whether they shouldn't be.
Can you give me an example of what you mean by recent events?
Sure. I mean, essentially, like, we know that, every law school has, and every student has been affected by events such as COVID, Black Lives Matter movement, etc. But I'm just debating whether or not, like, if I have a specific story in mind that I already wanted to tell, and it may not be in direct relation to very recent events, is it okay to basically not bring them up, or would that be seen as kind of being too removed from what's been happening?
Oh, no, I think it's fine not to mention them. I think the risk is actually the opposite, where people mention them too much. So I think they're going to get tons of COVID personal statements, tons of Black Lives Matter statements, tons of statements referencing Trump, and those can become cliche very quickly. And so if you don't have a good reason to mention them, definitely don't. And if you're thinking of mentioning them, make sure you have a very good reason for doing so that isn't going to be cliche.
Okay, got it. Yeah, that was the main thing I was just trying to figure out. Like, I was worried that if I didn't reference it at all, it would make it seem like I just haven't been paying attention in the past 6 months. But it seems like there's a bigger risk if you do decide to mention it.
Yeah, no, they're going to know that you're aware of COVID. Don't worry.
Yeah, okay. Thanks to you.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.